You forgot a word mid-sentence last week. You laughed it off, but part of you wondered. That moment of quiet panic. Most people never say it out loud. They don't ask their doctor. They don't tell their spouse. They just file it away and hope it doesn't happen again. Here is the truth. The signs that matter most in early neurological decline are not the dramatic ones. They are not the moments that land someone in an emergency room. They are the quiet ones. The ones that look exactly like normal aging. The ones that are easy to dismiss, easy to explain away, and almost always missed. In my neurology clinic, I see this pattern every week. People come in for something unrelated, fatigue, a fall, a follow-up. And when I ask the right questions, the picture shifts entirely. Today I want to walk you through 10 biological warning signs. Several of them have nothing to do with memory. Sign 4 is something you can test right now with a piece of paper and a pen. And most people have never heard of it. And somewhere in the middle of this list, I'm going to tell you about a daily habit. Something ordinary, something most people do before 8 in the morning, that may be speeding up the exact biological process behind all of these signs. Your brain is remarkably resilient, but it tells the truth before you're ready to hear it. Let's start listening. Sign number 1, the smell that isn't there anymore. I want you to think about your morning coffee, not whether you drink it, whether you smell it. Does the aroma hit you from across the room the way it used to? Does food smell as sharp and vivid as it did 10 years ago? If your honest answer is no, I want you to pay close attention to what I'm about to say. The olfactory bulb, the small brain structure that processes smell, is one of the first places touched by amyloid beta protein. This happens years, sometimes a decade before memory symptoms appear. It is not a coincidence. It is a biological pattern we see consistently in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. Here is why this matters. Smell signals do not travel a long route to reach the brain. They go almost directly into the limbic system, the same neighborhood where your hippocampus lives, where memory is made and stored. So when that olfactory pathway begins to dim, it is not just a nuisance. It is a meaningful neurological signal with a known anatomical address. Think of it like this. Imagine a long electrical cord plugged into a wall. If you pull the plug halfway out, the lamp at the end of the cord starts to flicker. The lamp is not broken. The cord is losing contact. In early dementia, olfactory loss works the same way. The signal is weakening at the connection point long before the room goes dark. The distinction I want you to hold on to is this. We are not talking about a stuffy nose. We are not talking about seasonal allergies or a head cold. We are talking about a gradual, persistent dulling of smell that does not come and go with illness, one that has quietly settled in over months or years. A patient came to see me some time ago for unrelated fatigue. Somewhere in the conversation she mentioned, almost as an aside, that food just didn't taste like anything anymore. She had assumed it was stress. That one offhand comment changed the direction of the entire visit. Olfactory loss often precedes memory complaints by years in people who later develop Alzheimer's. It is one of the earliest measurable changes we have. Most people never connect it to the brain because it doesn't feel like a brain problem. But smell is processed in the brain, not in the nose. And the next sign works exactly the same way. It looks like a physical problem, but the source is entirely neurological. Sign number 2, when your eyes work, but your brain doesn't. Let me ask you something. Have you ever reached for a glass and your hand landed slightly past it? Have you hesitated at the bottom of a staircase you have climbed 1,000 times? Not because your knees hurt, but because something about the depth felt uncertain. Have you misjudged a curb, or found yourself moving more carefully through spaces that used to feel automatic? Most people chalk this up to getting older. Stiff joints, slower reflexes, the body wearing down. But here is what I want you to understand. Visual spatial processing is not an eye function. It is a brain function. Your eyes collect light and send signals. Your brain, specifically the parietal cortex, takes those signals and builds a three-dimensional map of the world around you. Depth, distance, peripheral awareness, spatial judgment. All of it is processed and assembled inside your skull, not behind your eyes. When neurons in the parietal cortex begin to lose connectivity, that map gets imprecise. Not dramatically wrong, just slightly off. A centimeter too far when you reach. A half second of uncertainty on a step. The kind of thing that is easy to explain away and nearly impossible to self-diagnose. The clinical pattern I see is consistent. Patients describe themselves as clumsy. They say they have gotten uncoordinated. They blame their shoes, their flooring, their age. What they rarely say, because they have no reason to think it, is that their brain may be struggling to accurately place objects in space. One of the places families notice this first is driving. Not reaction time, not speed, spatial judgment. Parking becomes harder. Intersections feel less certain. Lane changes require more conscious effort. These are not attention problems. They are processing problems, and the source is neurological. This is not about needing glasses. Needing glasses is normal. Suddenly finding it difficult to judge where the edge of a table is, in a room you have sat in for 20 years, is not. The distinction matters because one leads to an optometrist appointment and the other should lead to a neurological conversation. Smell and spatial processing are both incoming signals. Information the brain collects from the world and tries to make sense of. But the brain is not just a receiver, it is also a sender. And what it sends outward, to your muscles, your movements, your body in space, is where the picture starts to get more personal. Sign number 3. The hippocampus and the failing filing system. Picture a very efficient filing clerk. Every experience you have, every conversation, every errand, every meal, gets handed to this clerk, who files it away into long-term storage so you can retrieve it later. The hippocampus is that clerk. When it is healthy, the system is seamless. You barely notice it working. When it begins to struggle, and this can start years before any obvious memory complaint, the filing slows down. Documents get misfiled. Some never make it into storage at all. This is where I want to draw a line that I think is genuinely important. Forgetting where you put your keys is not the sign I am talking about. That is a retrieval problem, and retrieval problems happen to everyone under stress, poor sleep, or distraction. What is different, what is worth paying attention to, is standing in a room with no sense of why you walked in and being unable to reconstruct the intention even after you sit down and try. Or retaining vivid memories from decades ago while the events of last Tuesday have simply not been stored at all. The earliest hippocampal sign is often that asymmetry. Old memories remain intact and sharp. New ones fail to consolidate. A person can describe their wedding in precise detail and not recall what they ate for breakfast. That gap, when it becomes a consistent pattern, is the brain's filing system beginning to drop files, not just misplace them. Now, here is something that most standard discussions of memory leave out entirely, and I think it is one of the most important biological connections in this space. During deep sleep, the brain runs what I think of as a night shift cleaning crew. This is the glymphatic system, a network of channels that flushes toxic protein buildup from brain tissue while you sleep. Amyloid beta, the same protein that accumulates in Alzheimer's disease, is among the waste this system is designed to clear. When sleep degrades, whether from stress, age-related changes, or metabolic disruption, that cleaning crew cannot finish the job. The buildup accelerates. The hippocampus, which is particularly dense with metabolic activity, bears a significant portion of that burden. This is not just about feeling groggy. Chronically disrupted sleep creates the conditions for the kind of protein accumulation that drives hippocampal stress over time. And the relationship runs in both directions. Hippocampal decline can itself disrupt sleep architecture, creating a cycle that is hard to interrupt once it is established. There is also a compensatory behavior worth noting, because I see it frequently in clinical practice, and families almost never recognize it for what it is. When people start leaving themselves notes for things they never needed reminders for before, alarms for medication they have taken for years, notes on the counter about whether they locked the door, that compensatory behavior is itself a clinical signal. It means something in the system has shifted enough that the person, on some level, no longer trusts it. They are not being organized. They are adapting to a gap they may not yet be able to name. Most of what we have discussed so far stays invisible. The private flicker of a missing word, the quiet uncertainty on a familiar staircase. Sign 4 is different. It does not stay hidden. It leaves a record you can hold in your hands. Sign number 4. The pen doesn't lie. I want you to do something before I explain what you are looking for. Find a piece of paper and write a sentence. Any sentence, something ordinary, the way you naturally would. Just write it out. Now, if you can find something you wrote 5 years ago, pull it out. A card, a list, a note in the margin of a book. Put the two pieces of paper side by side. Do not look at the words. Look at the size of the letters, the spacing between words. Whether the lines hold steady across the page or drift slightly downward. Whether the script feels open and easy or compressed and tight. This is called micrographia, and it is one of the most overlooked early physical signs of neurological change that exists. Here is the biology. Handwriting is not a simple motor task. It is a complex program that lives in the basal ganglia, a cluster of structures deep in the brain involved in coordinating movement, muscle tone, and the automatic execution of learned motor sequences. When you write, your basal ganglia is running a program it has run thousands of times. The letters come out at a consistent size because the brain is sending a consistent signal. When dopaminergic signaling in the basal ganglia begins to weaken, and this can happen as part of several neurodegenerative processes, not only Parkinson's disease, that program starts to lose precision. The letters get smaller, the spacing tightens. The writing becomes slower and more effortful, but crucially, the person doing it almost never notices. Because they are not comparing. They are just writing the way they write. That is exactly why this sign gets missed. We have no instinct to look at our own handwriting over time. There is no built-in reference point. So a slow directional change, letters shrinking over months, lines beginning to drift, words cramping together, happens entirely below the threshold of self-awareness. I had a patient, a retired teacher, who came in because her daughter had noticed something. She had been going through old paperwork and found grocery lists from a few years back. Neat, even, spacious handwriting. Then she looked at the lists her mother was writing now. Tiny, compressed script, the letters pressed close together as if the pen were running out of room. The writing itself was the record. Her mother had no idea anything had changed. Now, I want to be precise here because this matters clinically. Micrographia is most strongly associated with Parkinson's disease and Lewy body dementia, where basal ganglia involvement is central to the diagnosis. But basal ganglia changes appear across multiple neurodegenerative pathways, and the handwriting signal can show up without a tremor, without a diagnosis, and years before anything else becomes obvious. It is a signal worth taking seriously, regardless of what else is or is not present. A pen and a piece of paper. That is all this test requires. And what it may be recording is something your brain has been trying to tell you for longer than you realize. A piece of paper holds that record quietly, without judgment. But some signs are harder to contain. This one surfaces in the middle of a conversation and is almost always attributed to the wrong cause entirely. Sign number 5. When the brakes start to fail. There is a structure in the brain whose job is not to do things. Its job is to stop things. The frontal lobe acts as the brain's inhibition center. It filters impulse before it becomes action. It regulates emotional response before it becomes reaction. It governs social judgment, what is appropriate to say, when to hold back, how to read a room, before any of that gets expressed outward. When it is working well, you never notice it. That is the point. It runs silently in the background, constantly moderating. When it begins to weaken, the first thing you notice is not a memory problem. It is a personality shift. A calm person becomes irritable. A private person begins saying things they would never have said before, candid in a way that feels slightly off, slightly unguarded. A patient person becomes short-tempered in situations that never bothered them before. A person who was warm and engaged starts to seem distant, flat, hard to reach. Here is what is happening biologically. The frontal lobe is supposed to turn off reactive emotional responses before they surface. Think of it like a conductor standing in front of an orchestra. Every section of that orchestra can still play. The strings, the brass, the percussion, they all have the capacity to produce sound. But without the conductor cueing them, coordinating them, telling them when to hold back, things come out at the wrong moment and the wrong volume. The music still happens, it just stops making sense. When frontal connectivity weakens, those reactive responses fire without their usual buffer. Emotions that would once have been filtered become visible. Impulses that would have been modulated get through. And because the change is gradual, the person experiencing it often has no awareness that anything has shifted. The people around them do. Families describe it in very consistent language. He is not himself. She never used to react like that. This is not who she was. That observation, that a person has changed from their own baseline, is the clinical signal I take most seriously. Not the behavior itself, but the departure from what was normal for that specific person. This is one of the most emotionally difficult signs for families, because it changes the relationship before there is any diagnosis to point to. People grieve the shift before they understand what is causing it. I also want to mention something that gets missed with surprising frequency. Apathy. Not sadness, not grief, but a genuine flattening of motivation and interest is an early frontal sign that is routinely misread as depression. The two can look similar from the outside. but they are biologically different. Depression involves negative emotional content, sadness, guilt, a sense of worthlessness. Apathy involves the absence of emotional content. Not, I feel bad about not doing things. Just, nothing pulls at me anymore. I used to care about this. Now I don't feel much either way. This distinction matters clinically because the paths forward are different. Treating apathy as depression and missing the neurological picture behind it is a costly mistake, and it happens more than it should. What is worth sitting with is this. By the time a personality shift becomes visible to others, the underlying change has usually been building for a long time. And yet, it almost always gets noticed first in the middle of an ordinary conversation, where people rarely think to look for it. Sign number 6. The word that won't come. You are in a conversation. You are telling a story you know well. And then, right in the middle of it, the word simply is not there. You know exactly what you mean. You can feel the shape of it, almost reach it. But the specific word, the right word, the only word that fits, will not come. So you describe around it. You say, the thing on your wrist instead of watch. You say, you know, the one you use to cut instead of scissors. This is called anomia. And while everyone searches for a word from time to time, the clinical version of this, the one worth paying attention to, is different in its frequency, its pattern, and the specific type of words that go missing first. Nouns go first, especially proper nouns, names of people, names of objects, names of places that should be deeply familiar. The temporal lobe houses the brain's language retrieval networks. When connectivity between the temporal lobe and the hippocampus begins to degrade, the index that points toward words becomes unreliable. The word is still stored, it has not been deleted, but the pathway that leads to it is losing conductivity. Think of that same electrical cord from earlier. The lamp still works, the electricity is still there, but the cord is half pulled from the socket and the signal flickers. Some moments the light is steady, other moments it dims for just a beat, long enough to lose the word mid-thought. What I find clinically important is that in early stages, people retain full awareness that the word is missing. They know something has not come through. They feel the gap. That preserved insight, that frustration, that reaching, is actually meaningful. In later stages, that awareness fades. People stop noticing the missing word because the ability to monitor their own language output is itself compromised. There is a subtler version of this sign that is even easier to dismiss. Processing lag. Someone speaks to you, and the meaning takes a beat longer than it should to register. You hear the words, they just do not land with their usual immediacy. Most people assume they were not paying attention. They were. The processing is simply slower. If this is happening to you more than once a week, I want you to hold that thought, because the next sign does not show up in language at all. It shows up in something most people never think to observe about themselves. Sign number 7, the arm that stopped swinging. Stand up for a moment if you can. Walk to the other end of the room and back. Don't think about it, just walk the way you normally walk. Now ask yourself, did both arms swing? Most people have never once thought about their arm swing. That is exactly the point. When the brain is healthy, arm swing during walking is automatic. It requires no conscious direction. Both arms move in a rhythmic, symmetrical pattern that is generated and coordinated by the brain's motor system. Not by your intention, not by effort, not by any decision you make. It simply happens, the way breathing happens, the way your heart beats. When one arm begins to swing less than the other, or when both arms stay relatively still at your sides while you walk, it means the motor pathways governing that automatic movement are losing function. The brain is no longer generating a full bilateral signal. One side has gone quieter. This is an early marker in Parkinson's disease, where it is well documented. But reduced or asymmetrical arm swing appears in other neurodegenerative conditions as well, and it can precede any cognitive symptom by years. The motor system often signals decline before the memory system does. We just are not taught to look there. What I want you to notice is the word automatic. This is not about an arm that hurts, not about a shoulder injury or arthritis limiting range of motion. The arm I am describing is unloaded, pain-free, and free to move. It just does not. The signal that should be driving it has weakened. Closely connected to this are other subtle gait changes that tend to travel together. Stride length shortens. Steps become slightly shuffling rather than fluid. There may be a very mild forward lean that was not there before. None of these feel dramatic. They feel like aging. But aging alone does not explain asymmetrical arm swing in a person without a joint or structural problem. The brain does. Gait is one of the most sensitive early neurological indicators we have access to. Research consistently shows that walking pattern changes often precede cognitive symptoms, not by weeks, but by years. The body moves the way the brain tells it to, and the brain, when it is under neurological stress, tells a very specific story through movement, long before it tells that story through words or memory. Walk the hallway. Notice what your arms do. That observation costs nothing and takes 10 seconds. And if what you find gives you pause, stay with me, because the same system that controls movement also governs something people struggle with quietly for years before anyone thinks to name it. Sign number 8. When simple tasks become complicated. Think about something you used to do without thinking. Following a recipe you have made 50 times. Managing a monthly bill payment. Navigating a new route to a familiar destination. Planning a dinner with a few moving parts. Now think about whether any of those feel different than they used to. Not impossible, not catastrophic, just effortful in a way they were not before. Like something is running slightly slower than it should. That is executive function beginning to show strain. Executive function is the brain's project management system. It lives primarily in the prefrontal cortex, and its job is to hold the steps of a task in order, keep track of where you are in a sequence, and coordinate attention across multiple demands at once. It is what allows you to start a recipe on page 1 and finish it on page 3 without losing the thread. It is what lets you sit down to pay bills and move through them systematically rather than feeling suddenly overwhelmed. When prefrontal connectivity weakens, that internal workspace, what we sometimes call working memory, shrinks. The buffer that holds intermediate steps gets smaller. Tasks that once ran on autopilot now require conscious effort to sequence. And that effort is tiring in a way that is hard to explain to someone who has not felt it. Here is a way to picture it. Think of a garden hose connected to an outdoor tap. When the hose is fully open and flexible, water reaches every corner of the garden without any difficulty. When the hose kinks, somewhere in the middle, out of sight, the flow drops. Sections of the garden stop getting water. The tap is still on. The hose still works. But something in between is restricting what gets through. Executive function decline is that kink between intention and execution. What makes this sign particularly hard to catch is that highly capable, well-educated people often compensate for it so effectively that neither they nor anyone close to them notices for a long time. They stop cooking complex meals and say they have lost interest in it. They hand off the finances to a spouse and frame it as simplifying. They decline invitations that require navigation or multi-step planning and describe it as preferring to stay in. The avoidance is adaptive. It protects dignity and daily function. But it also hides the decline from the people who might otherwise recognize it as a clinical signal. This is frequently the sign that finally prompts a family member to call my office. Not a dramatic moment, just a slow accumulation of things that no longer seem to get done. There is a common biological thread running through everything we have discussed, and it connects directly to something you may be doing every single morning without realizing it is working against you. Sign number 9. The morning habit that's starving your brain. Here is the thread I promised you at the start of this video. Most mornings, without thinking much about it, people sit down to a breakfast built around carbohydrates. Toast, cereal, juice, a sweetened coffee drink. It is ordinary. It is familiar. And for the brain, particularly the hippocampus, it may be quietly doing damage that no one is talking about in a standard checkup. Here is what the research tells us. The hippocampus is packed with insulin receptors, more densely than almost any other brain structure. Insulin, in the brain, does not just manage blood sugar. It acts as a growth and repair signal for neurons. It supports synaptic plasticity, the brain's ability to strengthen connections and form new ones. When insulin signaling works well in the hippocampus, the system stays flexible and responsive. When it breaks down, the structure begins to atrophy. Chronic glucose overload, the kind that comes from years of high carbohydrate eating, particularly refined carbohydrates eaten first thing in the morning when the body is coming off an overnight fast, drives insulin resistance in brain tissue. The hippocampus stops responding to insulin the way it should. The repair signal gets ignored. Synaptic health degrades. Atrophy accelerates. Some researchers have called this pattern type 3 diabetes. Not because it requires a diabetes diagnosis, not because it shows up on a standard fasting glucose test. A person can have completely normal metabolic blood work and still have significant insulin resistance in brain tissue, because the hippocampus can become insulin resistant before the rest of the body shows any sign of it. The brain problem comes first. Now add the glymphatic connection from earlier. The same dietary pattern that drives brain insulin resistance also tends to destabilize blood sugar overnight, disrupting the slow-wave sleep that the glymphatic system depends on to clear amyloid beta. So the morning habit affects the night that follows, and the disrupted night accelerates the very protein buildup that insulin resistance is already promoting. I want to be clear about something. This is not a proven cure. I am not telling you that changing your breakfast will reverse dementia. What I am telling you is that the biological mechanism is real. The relationship between brain insulin resistance and hippocampal atrophy is supported by solid research, and the risk of adjusting what you eat before 8 in the morning is essentially zero. Extending the overnight fast by even a few hours, reducing refined carbohydrates at the first meal of the day, and giving the brain access to ketone-based fuel, these are not fringe interventions. They are direct, low-risk responses to a known biological process. And they connect directly to nearly every sign we have discussed today. Sign number 10, the quiet disappearance of initiative. The last sign on this list is the one I most want you to take seriously. Not because it is dramatic, because it is not. apathy. Not sadness, not fatigue, not the grief of a difficult season. A genuine, quiet loss of pull toward things that used to matter. The garden that someone tended for 30 years, now left to grow over. The phone calls to close friends that have simply stopped. The hobbies, the plans, the small rituals of an engaged life. Not abandoned with frustration, just quietly set down and not picked back up. Biologically, what is happening here is a weakening of the dopaminergic pathways that connect the frontal lobe to the limbic system. These pathways generate the neurological signal to begin. Not to feel good about something, not to enjoy it, simply to start. When they degrade, the initiating signal does not fire. There is no resistance. There is just an absence. Nothing pulls. Families describe it with a specific kind of sadness. He used to love that. She just doesn't seem to care anymore. And because the person is calm, not visibly distressed, not obviously struggling, it reads as contentment, as introversion, as a person settling into a quieter chapter. But change from baseline is the signal, not the behavior itself, the departure from who this person was. If you recognize this in yourself or in someone you love, please do not normalize it. Bring it to a neurologist. Bring it alongside the other signs from this list. Because apathy in this context is not a mood. It is the brain running low on the fuel that drives engagement with life. And here is what I want you to understand before you close this video. Everything we covered today, the olfactory changes, the handwriting, the gait, the processing lag, these are signs of a brain under gradual neurological pressure. You now know what to look for. That awareness is real, and it matters. But there is another process that can move much faster, one that does not give you months of subtle signals, one that can arrive without warning and erase progress in hours. And the early signs of it are just as easy to miss, and just as biological as everything we discussed today. What comes next? The brain you have been working to protect has one other serious threat that most people never learn to recognize until it is too late. I see it in my clinic. Patients who were proactive, who were paying attention, who were doing the right things, and who still missed what was building in the vascular system because no one had ever shown them what to look for in the days before it happened. There are warning signs. They are real, they are documented, and they appear in a specific window of time when intervention is still possible. Most people dismiss them as tiredness, a headache, stress. By the time they realize what was actually happening, that window has closed. The video on your screen right now walks you through exactly those signs, what they look like, why the brain produces them, and what to do if you or someone near you experiences them. Watching it is not optional if you are serious about protecting what you have built. Because the two processes, neurodegeneration and vascular events, share biology, share risk factors, and share a window of time when action still changes the outcome. Do not stop here. The next step is already waiting for you.